Welcome everyone to a special Lunch and Learn session today. My name is Carl Teichman. I'm Director of Government and Community Relations with Illinois Wesleyan. The university, along with the McLean County History Museum, sponsor these events. And it's my pleasure to welcome a good friend, Professor Emeritus of Politics and Government from Illinois State, Bob Bradley. Bob's going to be talking about assessing the first 100 days of the Biden presidency. A tradition, actually, I was interested to learn really the first 100-day assessment really only goes back to the tenure of Franklin Roosevelt. So it's not something that's been around for an extended period of time, but I'm sure Bob will have some interesting thoughts to share about the first 100 days of our current president. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Bob. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much. And I want to thank the History Museum and Illinois Wesleyan University for sponsoring this event and for inviting me to talk about Biden's first 100 days. And then I also want to thank all the attendees who are taking time out of their day to listen to this. For those of you who may have questions or concerns or reactions to what I say, you have my name, my former affiliation, Illinois State University, and probably most importantly, my email address. The Illinois State University has allowed me to keep my email address, which is very nice of them because I've used it for keeping in contact with a whole bunch of professional organizations. Now, what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about some of the public approval ratings in regard to Biden's first 100 days, talk about where this originated from. As Carl said, it did start with FDR. Talk a little bit about some of the comparisons that have been made between Biden and Roosevelt, and then some of the things that Biden has done. Now, in regard to the 100-day public approval ratings, I tend to rely in terms of national sampling on the Pew Research Center rather than some of the sampling done by some of the media outlets and others. And if you look, this is Biden's first 100-day public approval rating compared to other recent presidents. And you can see he fits pretty much in the mold. The only person that actually stands out in a way is his predecessor, Trump, whose public approval rating at his first 100 days is considerably lower than almost anybody else. The only other person who had a public approval rating less than 50% was Clinton in his first 100 days. So Biden is doing comparably well compared to other recent presidents. Where Biden has gotten high marks in terms of public opinion is in regard to the vaccine rollout. About 3/4 of Americans view that as very positive. Also, 3/4 of Americans like the COVID relief bill. Generally, it's hard to argue with receiving money. This is why a lot of Republican governors and mayors have not spoken out in regard to the COVID relief bill, spoken out in opposition to it because they know their citizens are getting money. And it's really hard to turn down money from the federal government. The other thing that Biden has gotten high marks on is civil discourse, that he has brought back or reintroduced civility at the federal level. Now, where he has gotten low marks on is in regard to immigration, and particularly dealing with the southern border. Their public approval is not nearly as high as the vaccine rollout. Same thing can be said about gun reform. There's lots and lots of Americans that would like some meaningful reform in regard to guns. And then also Biden, interestingly enough, has gotten pretty low marks on unifying the nation. People still see the nation to be sharply divided. that Republicans and Democrats are not really willing to compromise with each other, either at the national level or even the state or local level. That a lot of the nasty discourse between candidates is happening in municipal elections. We saw that very recently, both in the Normal and Bloomington races for mayor and even some of the city council races. So why do we do a 100-day assessment? There's a whole variety of people that feel that this is silly, nonsensical, doesn't really make a lot of sense in regard to politics, but we still do it. And there's a couple of reasons why it does matter. And one is that a lot of people think that this is part of the honeymoon period, that the president can best get things accomplished in his first 100 days, because this is when Congress, even if it's controlled by the opposing party, is willing to give him a break. Also, it's generally used to assess what's the agenda of the president. What are his most important priorities? And the reason why I'm using he and his is because to date, we still have not had a woman president. This all started with a fireside chat with FDR. And in July 1933, he said, and as you can read, the crowding events of the 100 days have been devoting to starting the New Deal. And he wanted to convince the public and basically ease their fears that the government was not doing anything. And he was trying to convince them, ease their fears through these series of fireside chats, that in fact, the federal government knew their pain and was going to do things to try to ease their pain. Now, in the 1930s, Roosevelt was facing a series of crises. First of all, there was the Depression. Over 9,000 banks closed. And you have up on the screen a picture of one of the banks where hundreds of people are waiting to withdraw their funds. Only a select few will be able to do so. The bank will close its doors and then will go under. 2 million plus farms shut down. There's a 25% unemployment rate across the nation. In some areas, it's closer to 35, 40%. And then a lot of people don't realize that the Depression was in fact worldwide. And this really affected trade in a variety of ways, because our normal trading partners were also affected by this. Their economic productivity was down, and so trade was really slowed as a result of the Depression. But there were other crises that were going on at the same time. There was a decade-long, more than a decade-long drought that was going on through much of the central part of the United States. And that's what was called the Dust Bowl. One of the things this led to was an incredible migration to California to escape the Dust Bowl. It also caused many, many farms to shut down, as we already talked about. It's also the beginning of organized crime. It is around this time that the FBI is formed to deal with the mafia and other elements of organized crime that had started making real inways in terms of municipal and some even state governments. And then fascism is emerging both in Europe and Japan, and that becomes obviously a crisis that we confront directly in World War II. FDR's first 100-day response is enormous. He signs 76 bills into law, including 15 major pieces of legislation. On average, in the time since Roosevelt, typically there's about 16 bills that are passed and 1 or 2 major pieces of legislation. Roosevelt has an advantage in that the Democrats, when he's first elected to the presidency, also dominate House and Senate elections. And he has overwhelming public approval. The public wants anything to be done to get them out of the depression and some other things that is happening in the nation. This leads to a fundamental transformation of the government and the private sector's relationship. That transformation is still what dominates politics today. How far should the federal government go in regulating or controlling the economy? This all starts with Roosevelt, his first 100 days. And then the nature of the political parties changed tremendously. Unions joined the Democratic Party, African Americans joined the Democratic Party, the Republican Party becomes more sort of a business-oriented party against government regulations, and that all happens during Roosevelt's first 100 days. Now, as I mentioned, there are a fair number of commentators and even some historians that are talking about Biden being compared to FDR. There are some grounds for this. One of the things that point to is the predecessors to both were intensely disliked by the majority of Americans. Most Americans by far did not like Hoover by the end of his term, and the majority of Americans did not like Trump. Even at the beginning of Trump's administration, as you saw, he only had 39% public approval. And the highest public approval that Trump ever got during the 4 years was basically in the mid-40s. He never did get a majority. World opinion of America declined. And a lot of people argue that this happened because of the predecessors to Roosevelt and the predecessor to Biden, partly because of the isolationist, anti-immigrant stances by both Hoover and Trump. And both confronted multiple crises, as we've seen. And they both have the same approach. The expansion, and some would argue the significant or tremendous expansion of the federal government's role in terms of our daily lives and in terms of the economy. One of the things that I think is very interesting as a comparison to both Biden and Trump is that the Supreme Court is viewed by both Biden and was viewed by Roosevelt as an obstacle to achieving their agenda. And what you have up on the screen is the most current official photo of the Supreme Court. The official photos of the Supreme Court are not taken annually. They are taken every time a new justice is confirmed to the Supreme Court. This one was months in the making because when Barrett was confirmed to the Supreme Court, it was in the midst of the COVID crisis. And so the Supreme Court did not want to gather in person for months. Also in this picture, one of the things to note is they sit and stand according to seniority. Chief Justice Roberts, because of the fact that he's the Chief Justice, is the most senior member of the court. So he sits in the middle. And then to his left is Justice Clarence Thomas, who is the most senior Associate Justice. Then it goes to the right, and to the right of Roberts is Breyer, who is the second most senior Associate Justice. And then to Thomas's left is Alito, and it just keeps flipping back and forth. And then for those standing, Kagan, who is to Roberts' left, is standing, is the shortest of the justices, is the most senior of those standing. And then it goes to Gorsuch, then it goes to Kavanaugh, then it goes to Barrett. Now, because both Roosevelt and Biden view the court as being an obstacle to their agenda, they did things. First of all, FDR called in one of his fireside chats the Supreme Court the greatest threat to democracy that the country was currently facing. This is interesting because, as we talked about before, fascism is emerging in Europe, and there's a guy by the name of Hitler who is starting to get the base together for his claim to power in Germany, Mussolini in Italy. But beside those, FDR calls the court the greatest threat to democracy. And he introduces his court packing plan. And what he does is wants to increase the size of the Supreme Court to 15. And that way his nominees and the Democrats would gain a majority on the court if you moved it to 15. Biden created a commission on Supreme Court reform. And of these elements, as you'll note at the bottom, one of the things that's been talked about is increasing the number of justices. In fact, there is a bill right now in Congress to expand the number to 15, which is sort of interesting because that's what Roosevelt wanted to expand the court to, was 15, primarily because during Roosevelt's time, similar to now, the conservatives dominated the court by a 6-3 number. That will likely not happen. There are some members of Congress that realize the public is generally not in agreement with increasing the size of the court. And then if you increase it to 15, what's to stop another president from coming in and saying, we'd really like 19, and then just go on from there. That bill will not see the light of day, will not come out of committee, will not be voted on by the full House or the full Senate. Another thing that's been talked about is changing the tenure of the justices. And instead of them serving life terms, make it a term of 10 or 15 years. The difficulty of that is if you change the tenure of the justices, you will have to amend the Constitution. And that's a very difficult thing to do. Other things that are more likely to happen is the top thing, and why I put it at the top, the Judicial Conduct and Disability Act. Right now, this act, which is a law passed by Congress, the Supreme Court is exempted from this act. So if in fact an appellate federal judge becomes disabled because of some type of medical reason, there are provisions in this law that covers that. For the Supreme Court, there's no provisions. Now, the thing that's getting some commentary right now is federal judges have to recuse themselves if they have a direct stake in a case before them. The Supreme Court, it's up to the justices to make a decision as to whether they should recuse themselves or not. And right now, Justice Barrett is scheduled to vote on a case dealing with a nonprofit organization that provided her substantial funding during the move to get her confirmed in the Senate. And some would argue this is a direct conflict of interest. It'll be interesting to see what Justice Barrett does and whether she excuses herself from dealing with a case, dealing with an organization that provided substantial amounts of funding to get her confirmed to the Supreme Court. Also, Congress has the ability to deal with the court's appellate jurisdiction. And this has happened, attempts at this have happened from time to time, even recently. There was an attempt by Congress to remove the court's ability to hear any case on appeal dealing with abortion. There's been, in the 1960s, there was a law introduced to remove the court's ability to deal with any case dealing with reapportionment. It'll be interesting to see what happens with this. I see a possible connection to this and a lot of the state proposals dealing with voting reform. And it would be very interesting to see if Congress moves to make sure that the court can't hear on appeal any law dealing with voting reform. Now, Biden, like Roosevelt, also is facing multiple crises. He's dealing with the COVID situation, the economic upheaval from the COVID situation primarily, the questions about racial equity that are occurring in this country, and climate change. And for those of you that think that climate change, that Central Illinois is far removed from climate change and its impact, there was a recent report just released on Central Illinois and agricultural practices in this part of the state dealing with climate change and saying that it's much more likely that temperatures are going to get significantly hotter during the summers, that they're going to be drier, and that those who are growing crops need to take that into account in a whole variety of ways. Other things that Biden is having to deal with is we saw for the first time in a country a violent assault on the US Capitol and an effort to basically alter election results. And we're still dealing with that in terms of whether the Capitol Police was adequately prepared, whether the government was adequately prepared in terms of the white supremacist movement and trying to orchestrate this assault. There's been a tremendous decline in the competency and trust in the federal government. Part of this is because there were so many federal government positions that went unfilled for 4 years under the Trump administration. And so you had a lot of the State Department was devastated because of this. The Department of Justice has taken a substantial hit in regard to competency and trust. And then the very legitimacy of the election. There are still people that are arguing adamantly that Biden is not the legitimate president of the United States. And that's something that Roosevelt did not have to deal with, nor did Roosevelt have to deal with basically an assault on the Capitol. Biden's response to these crises has been dozens of executive actions, including memorandums, proclamations, executive orders, and a lot of nominations to various federal agencies. Examples of proclamations, and the reason I mention a couple of these is because they're newsworthy, is he issued a proclamation ending the declaration of an emergency by Trump at the southern border and using that declaration of emergency to redirect funds from other federal agencies to build the wall. That redirection of fund has caused multiple court cases that are still active, but are likely to be declared moot now because Trump's no longer president. But this is also partly why the White House under Biden was very, very reluctant to use the label of crisis at the southern border. Because how could you end a declaration of emergency, but then subsequently call it a crisis at the southern border? That wouldn't make sense to a lot of the American public. So that's why for a long time, and still to date, they refused to call it officially a crisis at the southern border. And then they also issued a proclamation ending discriminatory bans for entry to the United States. This was generally called the Muslim ban, and he ended that by proclamation. Now, what he's done that's captured the attention of for a number of people, including myself, is he has signed a lot of executive orders. He signed 28 executive orders in his first 10 days of office. Each of these executive orders was grouped according to a policy area. So there was a number of executive orders on COVID. And then the next day, he would issue a number of executive orders on the economy. Then the next day, there was a number of executive orders aimed at immigration. And then there was a bunch of executive orders dealing with racial policy, and so on. This is a real stark contrast to his predecessor, who would issue executive orders, but they were not connected to particular policies. They seemed to be sort of random. There would be one on immigration, and then there would be one on national monuments. So there wasn't a cohesion between those executive orders. In his first month of office, Trump issued 7 executive orders, Obama issued 9 executive orders, and George W. Bush issued 2 executive orders. And so you can see that the 28 in the first 10 days far surpasses his predecessors. Executive orders, and the reason we're talking about them is because they are considered equivalent to a federal law. The courts have done this for quite a while, for a few decades, and they can be challenged in court, which is in fact what happened to Trump. A number of executive orders were in fact challenged in court. Some of those were in fact reversed by federal judges. Almost all these executive orders have been aimed at revoking or reversing Trump's executive actions. This highlights the concern that policymaking at the federal level now is dependent on executive actions rather than the legislature. And thus far, under Biden's first 100 days, less than 10 laws have been passed, but there have been dozens of executive orders. The downside of this is major policy and shifts in that policy are dependent on the views of the president rather than the legislature and subsequently the American people. And a great example of this is DACA. DACA is deferred action for childhood arrivals. Those children who are brought into this country by their parents, mothers who were pregnant who came into this country, then subsequently gave birth to a child in America, what are called dreamers. Obama wanted to help dreamers. Legislature wouldn't do it, so he did an executive action. Trump was not wild about dreamers and pursued executive action to make it more difficult for dreamers to stay in this country. Now Biden, once again, is saying that I like dreamers and is pursuing action to make it easier for them to stay here. So it's been sort of a yo-yo. Dreamers aren't sure what's going on in regard to them. And we will wait to see if Congress actually addresses this. I think one of the biggest things that has happened in the first 100 days of the Biden administration is what I call a return to normalcy. And I never, ever underestimate the value of normal. And White House information, we're no longer getting most of our information from late night tweets or impromptu question and answer sessions with reporters when Trump was about to go off by helicopter to a particular location for a rally or something else, and would meet with reporters out on the lawn of the White House and talk to them briefly. We're not getting that. The other thing that's not happening is we're not getting a consistent, regular stream of leaks from the White House anymore. And remember how many leaks we got on various issues involving the Trump administration, various people in the Trump administration, and that's not happening anymore. And that's actually, I think, a good thing. We now are having White House press briefings. They're held regularly by the White House press secretary. In fact, Biden has intentionally reduced his appearances before the press so that he is no longer the story, that the story is basically policy or legislation or proposals, and it's not him or his personality. And the White House and the press briefings has pledged to bring back truth and transparency. At the first White House press briefing under the Biden administration, an AP reporter was called on first. This restores a decades-old tradition of calling on wire services reporters first because of the general acknowledgement that a bunch of media outlets tend to favor or don't like a particular party or a particular person in the White House. Wire services have generally been acknowledged to be neutral, and that what their sole purpose is to gather the news, and this is why this tradition was started. Also, there's been no name calling of reporters. And all the news services, even including Fox and some of the other right-leaning services, have described White House press briefings as extraordinarily normal. The other thing that's happened is COVID briefings have changed. It used to be that Trump would lead the briefings with a variety of people, some of which included medical professionals and some who weren't medical professionals. Toward the end of the term, it was Trump leading the briefings on his own. The briefings now, as you can see, are done for the most part virtually, and every person on the screen on the right is an acknowledged public health expert, and they are leading the briefings. And thus you have the briefings that are much more tied into science and medical developments rather than other things that could come up under the Trump administration's briefings. When Biden came into office on January 20th, this is what he was confronted with. The vaccine, while in development, was not available in a final product in anywhere close to a sufficient amount to help protect the American public. There was, in fact, no reserve of vaccine. You had a number of states that administered their allotment of vaccine and then went to the federal government to get more, and were told there is no more. There was no distribution plan for the vaccine. Even if there had been vaccine that had been generally available, there was no national strategy for which states, which municipalities would get this vaccine in what order, what particular age groups would get it, what people and facilities, how would they get it. There was no plan. There was no plan at all. State and local health departments quickly became overwhelmed. This affected even this area. The McLean County Health Department quickly became overwhelmed, generally developed a partnership with Carl to run more clinics and have more clinics in other places in the county. The impact of COVID has been tremendous. It cannot be overstated. The US death rate in 2020 was the highest above normal ever recorded in the country. The highest had been in 1918 from the Spanish flu epidemic. Also, 2020 marked the largest increase in death rate from one year to the next. In 2020, the death rate jumped 16% from 2019. In 1918, the death rate jumped 12% from what it was in 1970. The next highest went to 1928, where it jumped 7% from 1927. All the other increases in death rate are well below 5%. These three stand out, and two of them stand out because they're in double digits. And that's one of many of the impacts of COVID. So what has happened is, in regard to Biden, he made the pledge of 100 million doses. In fact, 200 million doses plus have been administered. The majority of those over 16 have had their first dose. He rejoined the World Health Organization, restored a task force for planning in regard to not only COVID, but future pandemics, restored funding to the National Guard for pandemic work. We saw this with the National Guard basically running fairly nearby a clinic, and then deployed FEMA to set up vaccination sites and provide funding for school reopenings. Another part of the normalcy is he's the first president in decades not to have a single nominee defeated in the Senate. And he has halted the practice of depending on interim directors and heads, to which a lot of federal employees are very happy about. He has had 20 plus nominees. Not one of them has been defeated in the Senate. And this is remarkable because remember, the Senate is split evenly. And the polarization in the country is worse in Congress right now. The Republicans and Democrats don't talk to each other, do a whole assortment of things to indicate that they're polarized. And despite all that, he's not had a single nominee defeated. The one concern I have with his appointees is this guy, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. He is the second in command of the military, and he was granted an exemption from when he retired in the military to serving as Secretary of Defense. This 7-year supposed waiting time between when a person retires from the military to when they could serve as Secretary of Defense, I think is absolutely vital to maintain civilian control over the military. And this is the second exemption in a row that's been granted. The Trump administration got an exemption. Now the Biden administration's got an exemption. And I am hoping desperately that this does not become the practice, because it really erodes away from the civilian control aspect. Other things that I'm looking at is the restart of the process. Biden restarted the process of getting Harriet Tubman on $20 bills. Right now, there's a bill that has been voted on in the House to grant DC statehood. This is at the same time that Puerto Rico is being considered for statehood. Whether that goes anywhere or not, I doubt it, but it's interesting that both is happening at the same time. And the White House is behind both. And that's sort of rare for an administration. The voting reform proposals that are going on are very interesting. Police reform is going to get more of an impetus, particularly now with a change at the top levels of the Department of Justice. And then noting the progress on the bills that he talked about yesterday in his address to Congress, dealing with infrastructure and family relief. What I'm going to be very interested in is to see whether anything happens in regard to the filibuster rule in the Senate, and whether the White House gets behind changing that rule so that these bills have an easier time getting through. So wanted to let a little bit of time for the end, but anyhow, I thank you for your attention, and I don't know if we have time for questions or not.
Yeah, Bob, we do. If you have a question, if you'd like to put it in the Q&A part of the presentation. We do have a first question, though, from Chris, who said, with our nation as polarized as it is, how can President Biden unify the country? Republicans will hate anything he does, or if they don't hate it, like the stimulus bill, they'll never praise him or continue to look for wrongs. What can he do?
I think what he can do is sort of what he did last night. He did not demonize the Republicans. He offered multiple times saying that he would work with the Republicans. And one of the things that I think is sort of nice right now at the national level is remember where Biden comes from. He was on the opposite side. He was in the audience for most of these presidential addresses. He's used to working with senators. He's used to working with members of the House. He is meeting regularly with Republican members of Congress almost every day. And I think that needs to continue.
Other questions for Bob?
I was going to say, if not, one other point I'd like to make
Sure, go ahead.
in regard to this is there's a whole variety of foreign policy challenges that I didn't talk about and that he's confronted with. And one of the biggest ones that sort of has escaped the news a bit is North Korea. Because of COVID, the trade that North Korea normally has with China, and North Korea gets a lot of their food from China, a lot of their supplies from China, that has been stopped completely. And they're saying that North Korea right now, that millions of people could starve to death in North Korea in the not too distant future. And you wonder what the leadership of North Korea is going to do to distract the populace from that. And this is when North Korea started the nuclear program, was in the 90s, because of a very similar thing, where there was mass starvation in North Korea. And that really concerns me in a variety of ways as to what the leadership will do to try to distract the people from the plight of their daily lives.
Bob, I do have a question for you concerning the Supreme Court and the commission that he has organized to look at it. Where do you think that commission will go? Do you have any sense of what recommendations it might look at?
Well, the one I think, and the reason why I listed it at the top, is I think they're going to look at the Supreme Court's automatic exemption from the judicial conduct legislation, and particularly in regard to recusal. And it's really at an interesting time because right now, Justice Barrett is a really interesting situation right now. And this has come up before. I mean, Scalia dealt with some things where he should not have dealt with it, but he said, it's up to me. And I think I'm a good person, so I'm going to rule on it. And I'm not sure if we should do that, but it escapes most of people's attention that the Supreme Court's not under this. All other federal judges are. And so I think that, and then the other thing that I think will be interesting is to see if Congress does anything in terms of the absolute discretion the Supreme Court has to hear cases. And I think Congress could do something in regard to that. And one of the things that I've seen floated is for them to create a nonpartisan commission that will refer cases to the Supreme Court.
Okay. Another attendee asked the question, democracy seems to be in a fragile state these days. Have we seen this before in the US? Some GOP are saying that we aren't a democracy, but rather a republic.
Well, we are a Republican form of democracy. I mean, we don't gather, the several hundred millions of us don't gather at one time to pass law. So we're not a pure direct democracy. What we do is elect representatives to basically act on our wishes when we elect them, which is why it always bothers me when an elected representative, either at the local, state, or federal level, essentially says they're going to act on what they know is best for the community. And in a lot of ways, that's not what they were elected for. They were elected to represent their constituents and the public's views, not necessarily what they think is right. I think one of the things that struck me in President Biden's speech last night was saying that he wants to make sure that the autocrats throughout the world don't win, because democracy is too slow in acting, that there's too much blockades, there's too much gridlock, and it's stopping us from addressing important issues. And in a way, he's absolutely right on that. And we need to bring back a very valuable word for our system of government, which is the word compromise.
Yeah. Okay. Two questions have popped up. I'll take the first one here. Did the Republican choice for their rebuttal seem strange? He's not amongst the loudest voices in the party.
No, I think it was actually pretty astute. because of what the question said. And it's also astute because it's generally thought about right now that Senator Scott is in the lead in Congress to achieving a police reform bill. And in the minds of a lot of people, that's a pretty high priority issue. And so, and then also being an African-American from what is considered a Southern state and being a Republican, showing that the Republicans, in fact, are not all white, and they have an African-American senator out of South Carolina. A pretty astute choice in a variety of ways.
Okay. And then we have a question about your prediction for the 22 congressional election results.
Well, I'm not quite sure if they mean whether the Democrats will maintain control of the House and the Senate or stuff like that. The tradition is that the president typically loses seats in the first congressional race in his first term. Whether that remains true or not will be very interesting. One of the things I think is going to be very interesting is we don't really know whether President Biden's going to run for a second term or not. I mean, initially he sort of said no, and then more recently he has vacillated on it. And remember, this is a 78-year-old person. He is the oldest person to serve as president in our country. If he's reelected, he'll break that record by 4 years, clearly. And so the other thing that's interesting in Central Illinois is which congressional seat are we going to lose because of the census? And I have a feeling that Central Illinois is about to lose a congressional seat.
Okay. Would you like to speculate as to who that person might be, or?
Well, I will speculate. I don't know whether the norm is the party that's in control of the state legislature right now, the Democrats. They want to play nice with the other party, so they typically don't put incumbents from the other party into the same congressional district. Mm-hmm. But I think in this situation, that might go out the window, because you have one of the people that could be put in the same congressional district has been pretty outspoken in terms of the election results and how much they like Trump. And the other person hasn't been that outspoken, but still isn't generally liked by the Democrats. So I have a feeling that Davis and LaHood could end up facing each other, because I think their congressional districts could be melded.
Okay. Wasn't that the case, though, with Adam Kinzinger in the last redistricting in 2010? Wasn't he put up against a fellow Republican, or did I misremember that?
That happened too, and that's what happened. You know, the Democrats are in control of the legislature, so they could do this. Central Illinois, I mean, it would actually work out sort of nicely for Central Illinois if those districts were melded, regardless of whether you like or dislike the incumbent holding it, because it would mean Bloomington Normal would be in the same congressional district. And right now, Bloomington Normal is split between the congressional districts.
Okay, great. Okay. Well, we are at our appointed hour. So Bob, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and participating today. And I'll turn it over to Jeff. Jeff?
Thank you. And thank you, Bob. It's always fascinating every time you present. And I'll just be curious as well to see what happens with HR 7120, the policing bill, and what Biden does with that as he tries to work with the Senate on it. I know you noted earlier that Biden's got high marks, I guess, for civil discourse.
Right.
Yeah, so I'm going to offer all of you today high marks as well here locally for civil discourse. Always appreciate that. And thanks to Tori, and she's in the background with Digital Humanities for the Museum of History. And also just want to say thank you to our participants. And the next Lunch and Learn, we will invite you to join us for Brahms' use of motive to unify his 3 intermezzi, Opus 117, with Franklin and Larry. With that, we bid you all a good day.
Great.
Thanks again, Bob.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thanks, Bob.
Yeah.
Thanks. Hey,